One of the big debates in development now is the number of poor people living in middle-income countries. So I think the figure is around 75%. How would you say that plays out? Because, so DFID have about 26 country programs. They have to focus their efforts in a small number of countries, and yet we have poor people in middle-income countries, even like Kenya, let alone Brazil and so on. So how does it help DFID, or does it help DFID to work through these multilaterals? And is that one of the reasons why they're putting so much money to the agencies like the Global Fund?
I think you raise a very good point, and I think there's been some very interesting papers coming out recently about the next strategy for DFID going forward, about how they're going to think about the middle-income countries alongside the, if you like, the countries they've now focused down to in terms of the bar from last time around. I think what I came away from this review thinking was that as part of this strategy about how to use the multilateral agencies, one of the critical parts of that strategy should be what role do we think these our funding of the multilaterals is playing in our support for the countries that we're not actually operating in anymore. And I think it's a very fundamental part of it, and you could easily imagine some statements about the kind of things we think it's important that our core funding is supporting these agencies to operate in places where we are not present, and let's just make sure that that's actually happening, because I think in the end of the day there's going to be this tension. Of course we see it and we feel the need to deal with the poorest, to deal with the fragile and conflict states, as was touched on in terms of the numbers. The reality is it's going to leave behind a lot of poor people, like in India and elsewhere around the world, who need support from the kind that these agencies can provide. So I think, again, to me, it's rather than being an accident that multilaterals support these other issues, let's make it a deliberate agenda and be clear about what we expect from them with regard to it. I think it would be a very important part of a more holistic answer from DFID as to who it's trying to help around the world.
Sorry, Romilly.
Can I just add a couple of points on that? One of the things we've been looking at is sort of trends of overall level of resources that you get as countries as your income changes, and actually we do find this sort of missing middle issue that countries, once they graduate from low income to middle income status, they actually get less resources because their ODA goes down more than their tax resources go up. And I think this is where multilaterals, particularly MDBs, have a really critical role, because those countries probably don't need grants. Well, some of them may, some of the lower middle income, but sort of middle income countries probably don't need grants, but actually the MDBs can have an incredibly important role around the sort of non-concessional or semi-concessional public finance. So if you're thinking about DFID, you're thinking, well, we provide largely grants here, but actually the MDBs can provide sort of less concessional public finance quite effectively to countries that really need it. The other point to say, though, is that I do think this concentration of poverty in middle-income countries will gradually erode over time. So what our projections we've relied on show is that actually those poor people in those countries that are growing very fast probably will get lifted over the poverty line fairly soon, unlike those in fragile states.
How did the Commission address the allegation of fraud and misuse of funds with taxpayers' money?
We've issued 2 reports that deal with the question of fraud and corruption. The first, which is one of the first suites, in the first suite of reports that we published, was dealing with what you might call the macro issues, and essentially said that it was necessary for DFID to really focus actively and deliberately on the reduction of fraud in developing countries, and on making sure that its own systems actually enabled it to track what was happening to the money that it was handing over to people, to make sure that we knew as a country through Parliament, through DFID, through Parliament, what was happening to our funds. One of the key recommendations that we made in that report was that DFID should appoint somebody at board level to take responsibility for this, because I think we're great believers. If you want something to happen in an organisation, somebody in that organisation at the right level has to have that as the reason they come into work in the morning, is to actually do that thing and to make it happen. And they responded very positively to that, and they transferred a chap called Mark Bowman, who was a senior person, board level person in HM Treasury, across into DFID for a period to head up that activity. And as a result of that, they've put together country-by-country strategies in terms of addressing the question of fraud. They've also put into place other processes to enable the use of funds to be tracked in a more effective way. So there's I think, good progress being made as a result of that report being issued. There is, of course, always more progress that can be made there. And I think the fact of life is that in every country, pretty well, there is misuse of funds. And we're never going to have a situation where there is no misuse of funds in any country in the world. That would be an unrealistic ambition, but we should work to absolutely minimise it as much as possible. And it's actually worth noting in things like the Transparency International perception indices when it comes to corruption. The UK is not the best country in that perception. The UK, I think, the last one I saw was the 16th best. The United States was the 24th best. Countries at the top, but really the Scandinavian countries are the ones that are perceived as being most virtuous in these things. The second report, which we issued relatively recently, was looking much more in terms of the way in which fraud and corruption affect the lives of the poor in developing countries. So this is looking at the woman with a babe in arms who has to pay a bribe to get a vaccination for the baby. This is looking at the parents who have to pay bribes to get their children educated, that type of thing. And really we found that there was nothing like enough focus on dealing with those sorts of issues. And we recommended that action be taken to make sure that the effect of corruption and fraud on the day-to-day lives of individual poor people really should be attacked in combination with, clearly with the host governments in the countries to minimise that dreadful effect on people, the effect it has on people's sort of feeling about themselves, on people's feeling of hope for the future, and on their ability to raise themselves out of poverty through decent economic activity. That was issued very, very recently. There was a mixed response, I think, from DFID, would be fair, in relation to that. But we know that since then, a new very high quality person has been appointed to look after this area. That individual has got a real sort of will to address it, and is starting to put in place necessary actions to address it. So I'm optimistic about the future on that, but my optimism has yet to be proved to be justified because there was action to be taken over a period of time.
My question is on following the money. While working with multilateral organizations, DFID, how do they make sure that their aid money is spent for the intended purpose? And how do they make sure that it's not contributed, or it's not contributing to any other bad things going on in that country? And if these kind of things makes headlines, and that one will bring the public perception about foreign aid to be a bit different. And at this time of austerity, where public perception is wanting, how do they make sure that it's contributing to the intended purpose?
Well, I touched on a bit by Graham in terms of some of our work on fiduciary controls, which is our first report. I mean, I think that actually we feel that DFID has got a stronger and stronger hand over the course of the past 4 or 5 years on what I call the fiduciary control of UK funds going through these various channels. And that includes the multilaterals. And in fact, as I would say, what our report kind of found was a lot of the interaction now with the multilaterals in country is about their fiduciary controls. So they are double checking and triple checking that UNICEF is looking after the money through its various layers, through to different NGO partners that are using it, spending a lot of their time doing that. Where we had a concern, it's about this question about kind of what to stop, that Romilly mentioned. My feeling is what our report said was, frankly, you've got to trust to a great degree the multilaterals to follow their protocols. And if they make a mistake, it's their problem. They need to be held accountable for it. But second guessing that and double checking it and triple checking it, as opposed to worrying about whether UNICEF have the right quality people to be doing the things it's being asked to do and is being effective was our main point. Focus on, on the quality of the work they're doing rather than on all the effort going into the fiduciary controls. Clearly, you need to not completely throw the baby out with the bathwater about this, but we feel that due diligence has slightly lurched to one particular dimension of these organisations rather than the holistic capacity that they have.
A few years ago, we were asked by the heads of MDBs to write a report on private sector development and focusing particularly on crowding out. So MDBs doing harm through damaging private sectors. And we found real difficulty in even getting the core 7 or 8 MDBs that ought to be agreeing with each other to come up with codes of conduct that they might agree. Now, they ultimately did sign up to a very high level one. But one of the reasons the EID wanted to do this was not just because of possible harm done by the EID with too much money and not enough people, but was to address the new sort of the BRIC and Chinese development entities that were going to appear and that were going to flood the world with money. And so, in a way, this is a comment more than a query, but perhaps for Mark and Romilly. I'm wondering whether DFID can have any, well, first of all, can it have an impact even in the entities where it has a shareholding, and therefore is it too late now to create a benchmark that can be brought into by these other entities, or are they just going to completely ignore and steamroll past any best practice components that are brought in across MDBs?
Well, I think that our second recommendation, which is about DFID being more aware of the landscape of the players in the country as a piece of input to its thinking, is really important, and that includes very much in our view the competitive points that were raised by Romilly, not just the current players, but actually what's happened to the new guys coming in. We heard directly in Uganda about the fact that the EU is being basically outbid by the Chinese for most of the road projects in Uganda right now because they're just so much easier to do business with, and the decision-making processes are so much faster. A road is built a road is built and completed by these other players much faster than the EU even writes the proposal up into the headquarters to be approved on it. And so this issue of competitiveness, and obviously then about understanding some things that come in that package, of course. It's not just about the price for something, but I think understanding the competitive landscape and then understanding the role of these players better should lead to also understanding questions like you're raising about, is there too much being pumped into a certain kind of work? If all of these agencies are, for example, all trying to do microfinance in the agricultural sector, let's understand that, and if actually we can see the sum of that and recognise that adds up to 90% of the money going into a particular sector, let's start a dialogue about whether that's the best way for it to be used to solve the problems in that particular country, particularly if we're going to be starting up our own sort of private sector activities. So I think one of the challenges of economic development coming into the mix will be to understand the economic development landscape and then to understand the extent to which these banks are or are not crowding out markets.
And may I just, sorry, quickly before, this is really what we're getting at with recommendation 5 in this report, to which Romilly made reference, is actually to avoid that and to avoid what would seem to be a crazy position of a whole bunch of different institutions competing with each other to do the same thing, while at the same time perhaps in ignorance not doing other things that would also be of real value to the country in which they're operating. So it's saying to get a grip on the picture of what the country as a whole needs to be done in agreement with the government and the people of the country, and then do it in a way which is complementary amongst what the different institutions are doing, not competitive. And that's actually much better from the point of view of the fate of the poor men and women and poor children who are in that country and lifting them up out of poverty.
To what extent do you think that the recipient countries, particularly in Africa, are interested in what we are discussing actually? I mean, impact and efficiency. To what extent do they thematize these issues in the African public? Because I think that transformative change is actually about that they really think about what we are discussing here. But I have 10 years experience in research and think tank and so on. But I think that kind of debate is really missing in Africa. And if you want to achieve transformative change, I think that kind of debate needs to be actually multiplied in African society.
It's an absolutely fascinating point raised. Thank you very much indeed. And of course, yes, how are these debates taking place, and is everyone involved, and or is this just addressing the self? I think it's absolutely critical point.
And most recently, the impact report took me to Ethiopia and Rwanda, and there the governments are absolutely on this agenda and topic, and very, very actively involved and setting the agenda and bringing the donors along with them and working hand in hand. And there are issues in those countries in terms of whether it's freedom of speech, working with CSOs, human rights, but in terms of a development agenda, it's very, very strong. Of course, in other countries, the political settlement is an entirely different kettle of fish, and then that level of engagement is much harder. And of course, DFID used to provide a great deal of general budget support in Rwanda and Ethiopia. It's still providing a huge amount of sectoral budget support, and that gives it a seat at the table. But even in Rwanda, I was being told by very senior Rwandan government officials that DFID and the other agencies had effectively ceded their seat at the high-level policy table because they were now providing sectoral support rather than general support. And that's even with a government that genuinely is discussing these issues. So of course with other political settlements it's an infinitely more difficult subject, and the more fragile the country, the more of an issue that becomes. And one of the things that we've seen is the nature of that debate is very, very, not surprisingly, dependent on the quality of the head of office. And some head of offices are good at this stuff and work well with the Foreign Office, and others aren't so good at it. So I think it's a huge issue.
My question is about the international development context of this country. And it's probably an unfair time to ask with a single party government newly in its seat, but the institution is the same and the Secretary of State's the same. I have it on good authority that when ICAI was first appointed, it received an assurance of top-level political support to make sure that whatever it recommended would not be allowed to be deflected or buried or blown away by inertia or by institutional or other vested interests. It's a good moment just to ask Graham Ward, if he doesn't mind, to say, was that assurance in fact fulfilled over his 5 years? And what does he think the auguries are for his successor?
I don't believe it's an unfair question at all, actually. I mean, the fact is that, yes, Andrew Mitchell, when he was Secretary of State, of course he was Secretary of State when we were established, did give a commitment to support us. He committed that we would have a particular amount of funds over what we now call phase one of ICAI, and that commitment has been met. He committed that our recommendations would be taken seriously, and probably it was phrased in terms of something like wherever possible would be implemented, because that's the sort of thing that Secretaries of State say. But I mean, his heart was very much in that happening, and indeed he practiced what he preached, and we had that support for our recommendations. So yes, it was achieved. The second Secretary of State, and of course now the current Secretary of State, Justine Greening, has also provided strong support to the recommendations that we have put in. Perhaps the best example in practice of the current Secretary of State's support was, you'll recall, the Red Report that we issued on trademark Southern Africa, where we were very concerned about issues like governance and proper use of funds and financial management. The Secretary of State, as soon as we had got that report into her hands, did take immediate action in terms of closing the programme, in terms of recovery of funds that have been paid in advance of need, and instituted a bunch of other reforms around those sorts of programmes, which were very much designed to prevent the recurrence of what it is that we had found in that circumstance. So my view would be, yes, I mean, we've had a tremendous amount of political support for what it is that we've been doing, and my discussions with other agencies, if you like, if we're an agency anyway, other bodies who are concerned with making constructive critiques of the activities of government, is that actually the support for us and for the recommendations that we have made has been higher than pretty well in any other area that you might choose to pick. Can give you some numbers, not including the 2 reports that we put on the table this morning, where clearly it's too early. But we have made 129 recommendations over the last 4 years. Of those, 96 have been fully accepted, 25 have been partially accepted, and only 8 have been rejected. Interestingly, one of the ones that's marked as being rejected, we say we recommend that DFID do X. DFID put against that reject, and then there's a column in the response that said action to be taken by DFID, and DFID have committed to do X in the action columns. I might actually reduce that 8 and increase the 96, but I think proportionately for a body such as ours and the recommendations that we've been making, I think that's a pretty good hit rate.